What's up, folks? Tonight, we're exploring why it sucked to be a medieval blacksmith. So, without further ado, let's get this story rolling. The acrid smell of burning coal and the relentless hammering against red-hot iron filled every waking moment of a medieval blacksmith's existence, creating a life that was simultaneously essential to society and utterly brutal for those who lived it. Picture yourself stepping into the dim, smoky interior of a 13th century forge, where the air itself seems to shimmer with heat and the constant din of metal against metal creates a rhythm that would drive most people to madness within hours. This was the daily reality for countless men who chose, or more often were born into, one of the most demanding and dangerous occupations of the medieval world. The medieval blacksmith occupied a curious position in society, respected for his essential skills, yet trapped in a profession that would systematically destroy his body, mind, and often his spirit over the course of what was typically a shortened lifespan. Unlike the romanticized images we might conjure today of the noble craftsman working leisurely at his anvil, the historical reality was far more grim and unforgiving. These men were the backbone of medieval technology, responsible for creating everything from horseshoes and farming tools to weapons and armor. Yet their reward for this indispensable service was a life of constant physical torment and social limitations that would seem almost unimaginable by modern standards. Consider for a moment the sheer physical demands that began before dawn and continued well past sunset, day after day, season after season, with no concept of weekends, vacations, or retirement as we understand them today. A blacksmith's day typically began at 4 in the morning, not by choice but by necessity, as the forge needed to be heated and prepared for the long day ahead. The process of bringing a cold forge to working temperature was itself a grueling task that required hauling heavy loads of coal or charcoal, arranging the fuel in precise patterns to ensure proper airflow, and then working the massive leather bellows for what could be hours until the fire reached the intense heat necessary for metalworking. The bellows system, often operated by an apprentice or assistant, if the blacksmith was fortunate enough to afford one, was a contraption that demanded constant, rhythmic pumping to maintain the oxygen flow that kept the forge burning at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. For smaller operations, which were the norm rather than the exception, the blacksmith himself would be responsible for this backbreaking task, pumping the bellows with one hand while attempting to manipulate red-hot iron with the other, a feat of coordination and endurance that would leave even the strongest modern athlete gasping for breath within minutes. The heat itself was perhaps the most immediate and obvious source of suffering for these craftsmen, but its effects went far beyond mere discomfort. Working day after day in temperatures that could exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the immediate vicinity of the forge created a state of chronic dehydration that medieval blacksmiths had little understanding of and even fewer resources to combat effectively. Clean, safe drinking water was often scarce, and the concept of electrolyte replacement was entirely unknown, meaning that these men would spend their entire working lives in a state of physical stress that would be considered dangerous by any modern occupational safety standard. The constant exposure to extreme heat also had devastating effects on their skin, which would become permanently scarred, cracked, and weathered from years of proximity to the forge. Burns were not occasional accidents but daily occurrences, as tiny sparks and fragments of red-hot metal would constantly fly from the anvil, embedding themselves in exposed skin or setting clothing ablaze. Most blacksmiths bore the permanent marks of their trade across their hands, arms, and faces, a living testament to the hazardous nature of their work that served as both badge of honor and visible reminder of their suffering. The respiratory damage caused by spending decades inhaling the toxic fumes and particulates generated by the forge was perhaps even more insidious than the visible burns and scars. Medieval forges burned coal, charcoal, and various other materials that produced clouds of carbon monoxide, sulfur compounds, and microscopic particles of metal and ash that would settle deep into the lungs with every breath. Over time, this constant exposure would lead to what we now recognize as severe occupational lung disease, causing chronic coughing, shortness of breath, and eventually complete respiratory failure that would claim the lives of many blacksmiths long before they reached old age. The noise level in a medieval forge was equally damaging, though its effects were less immediately apparent than the burns and heat exhaustion. The constant hammering of metal against anvil, often for 12 to 16 hours per day, created sound levels that would cause permanent hearing damage within months of beginning the trade. Most experienced blacksmiths developed severe hearing loss that progressed to near total deafness by middle age, isolating them from normal conversation and social interaction in ways that compounded the already significant challenges of their profession. Beyond the immediate physical hazards, the repetitive nature of blacksmithing created a host of musculoskeletal problems that would plague these craftsmen throughout their lives. The act of swinging a heavy hammer hundreds or thousands of times per day placed enormous stress on the shoulders, elbows, and wrists, leading to chronic pain and arthritis that would make even simple tasks excruciating by the time a blacksmith reached his 40s or 50s. The awkward positions required to work at the anvil, often bent over for hours at a time while manipulating heavy pieces of iron, created severe back problems that were compounded by the lack of any effective medical treatment for such conditions. The tools of the trade themselves were primitive by modern standards and added their own layer of difficulty and danger to an already challenging profession. Medieval hammers were crude, often poorly balanced implements that required enormous strength to wield effectively, and the constant jarring impact as they struck the anvil would send shock waves up through the blacksmith's arms and into his spine with every blow. Tongs for manipulating hot metal were similarly basic, offering little protection from the intense heat and requiring a grip strength that would leave hands cramped and aching at the end of each day. The anvil, that iconic symbol of the blacksmith's trade, was itself a source of constant physical stress. These massive blocks of iron, often weighing several hundred pounds, needed to be positioned at exactly the right height for effective work, but medieval understanding of ergonomics was non-existent. Most anvils were set too low, forcing blacksmiths to work in a hunched position that placed tremendous strain on the lower back and neck. The surface of the anvil, while hard enough to shape iron, was also unforgiving to human flesh, and countless blacksmiths bore permanent indentations on their hands and forearms from accidental contact with its sharp edges. The economic realities of medieval blacksmithing were equally harsh and added a layer of financial stress to the already overwhelming physical demands of the profession. Despite being essential to their communities, most blacksmiths operated on extremely thin profit margins that left little room for error or misfortune. The cost of raw materials, particularly iron and fuel for the forge, represented a significant portion of their income, and the unpredictable availability and pricing of these materials could quickly drive a blacksmith into debt or bankruptcy. Iron in medieval times was expensive and often of poor quality, requiring blacksmiths to work with materials that were inconsistent, difficult to shape, and prone to failure at critical moments. A single batch of inferior iron could ruin hours of work and waste precious fuel, representing a financial loss that many small blacksmith operations could not absorb. The process of obtaining iron was itself problematic, as most blacksmiths were dependent on traveling merchants or distant suppliers, who might arrive weeks or months behind schedule, leaving the craftsman with no work and no income while his overhead costs continued to accumulate. The fuel situation was equally precarious, as the enormous quantities of coal or charcoal required to maintain forge temperatures were expensive and difficult to store safely. A typical blacksmith might burn through hundreds of pounds of fuel per week, and the cost of this material often exceeded the value of the finished products he created. In many regions, deforestation had made charcoal scarce and expensive, forcing blacksmiths to travel great distances to obtain fuel or to pay premium prices that ate into their already meager profits. The seasonal nature of much blacksmith work created additional financial instability that made it difficult to maintain a consistent income throughout the year. Agricultural communities had little need for new tools or repairs during the winter months, when farming activities were minimal, yet the blacksmith's overhead costs continued regardless of demand. This feast or famine cycle meant that many blacksmiths would experience periods of intense activity during planting and harvest seasons, followed by months of minimal income during which they struggled to feed their families and maintain their equipment. The social position of medieval blacksmiths was a complex mixture of respect and disdain that reflected the contradictory nature of their role in society. While their skills were absolutely essential and their services were constantly in demand, they were often viewed with suspicion and sometimes fear by their neighbors and customers. The forge was seen as a place of dark magic and supernatural power, where ordinary iron was transformed through processes that seemed to defy natural law and common understanding. This association with the mystical and potentially demonic aspects of metalworking created a social isolation that went beyond the physical demands of the profession. Many people believed that blacksmiths possessed supernatural abilities or were in league with dark forces, a superstition that was reinforced by the dramatic visual spectacle of the forge, with its roaring flames, flying sparks, and the seemingly magical transformation of cold, hard iron into glowing, malleable metal that could be shaped at will. The noise, smoke, and smell associated with blacksmithing also made it difficult for these craftsmen to integrate fully into their communities. Forges were typically located on the outskirts of towns or villages, not only because of the fire hazard they represented, but also because the constant hammering and acrid smoke made them unwelcome neighbors. This physical separation from the community contributed to the social isolation that many blacksmiths experienced, creating a barrier between them and their customers that went beyond simple economic transactions. The apprenticeship system that governed entry into the blacksmithing trade was another source of hardship that began in childhood and continued for many years. Boys as young as 7 or 8 years old would be bound to master blacksmiths for periods of 7 to 10 years, during which they would receive minimal pay and often harsh treatment while learning the demanding skills of the trade. These apprentices were essentially indentured servants who could be bought, sold, or transferred between masters with little regard for their personal wishes or well-being. The learning process itself was brutal and dangerous, as young apprentices were expected to work in extremely hazardous conditions while their bodies were still developing and their judgment was immature. Many apprentices suffered severe injuries during their training, including burns, crushing injuries from heavy hammers or falling tools, and respiratory damage from prolonged exposure to forge fumes. The master blacksmith was under no obligation to provide medical care or compensation for injuries, and apprentices who were permanently disabled often found themselves abandoned with no means of support. The psychological stress of the apprenticeship system was compounded by the harsh disciplinary methods that were considered normal and appropriate for training young craftsmen. Physical beatings for mistakes or perceived laziness were routine, and apprentices had no legal recourse against masters who abused their authority. Many young men emerged from their apprenticeships with not only the technical skills of blacksmithing, but also deep psychological scars from years of harsh treatment and constant fear. Even after completing their apprenticeships, newly qualified blacksmiths faced enormous challenges in establishing their own operations. The cost of setting up a forge, purchasing tools, and acquiring initial supplies of raw materials was often beyond the means of young craftsmen who had worked for years without significant compensation. Many were forced to remain as journeymen for additional years, working for established masters while slowly accumulating the resources needed to become independent, a process that could take decades to complete. The guild system that governed many medieval trades provided some protection and support for established blacksmiths, but it also created additional barriers and restrictions that limited their freedom and economic opportunities. Guild membership was expensive and often required connections or family relationships that were not available to all qualified craftsmen. Those who operated outside the guild system found themselves excluded from the most lucrative contracts and subjected to various forms of economic pressure designed to force them into compliance with guild rules and fees. Guild regulations also restricted the types of work that blacksmiths could perform, the prices they could charge, and even the techniques they could employ in their craft. Innovation was discouraged or forbidden outright, as guild masters sought to maintain their monopolistic control over traditional methods and markets. This stifling of creativity and progress meant that blacksmiths were trapped in outdated, inefficient working methods that made their already difficult jobs even more challenging and dangerous. The legal status of medieval blacksmiths was another source of vulnerability and stress that added to the many hardships of their profession. In feudal societies, craftsmen occupied a middle position between the nobility and the peasantry that left them without the protection enjoyed by either group. They were not bound to the land like serfs, but neither did they enjoy the legal privileges and immunities of the aristocratic classes, leaving them vulnerable to arbitrary taxation, legal harassment, and other forms of exploitation by powerful individuals or institutions. Property rights for blacksmiths were often tenuous, as their workshops, tools, and inventory could be seized by lords or creditors with minimal legal justification. The expensive equipment required for blacksmithing made these craftsmen attractive targets for various forms of extortion and forced taxation, as local authorities knew that the blacksmith's livelihood depended entirely on maintaining access to his tools and workspace. The threat of confiscation was a constant source of anxiety that influenced every business decision and personal relationship. The criminal justice system offered little protection for blacksmiths who found themselves victims of theft, fraud, or violence. Their intermediate social status meant that they had few powerful allies to call upon for protection, while their wealth relative to the peasant class made them attractive targets for criminals who knew that. Blacksmiths typically kept valuable materials and finished goods in their workshops. The isolated location of many forges made them particularly vulnerable to robbery and vandalism. Yet the legal system provided little recourse for recovery of stolen property or compensation for damages. Marriage and family life for medieval blacksmiths were complicated by the demands and dangers of their profession in ways that created Additional stress and hardship. The physical demands of blacksmithing often left men too exhausted for normal family activities, while the long hours required to maintain a profitable operation meant that many blacksmiths were absent from their homes from before dawn until well after dark throughout most of their adult lives. The health hazards associated with blacksmithing also posed serious risks to family members, particularly wives and children who lived in close proximity to the forge. The toxic fumes, metal dust, and other pollutants generated by metalworking could cause respiratory problems and other health issues in family members who had no direct involvement in the trade. Many blacksmith families lived in quarters attached to or adjacent to the workshop, making it impossible to escape the constant exposure to these harmful substances. The financial instability inherent in blacksmithing made it difficult to provide adequate food, clothing, and shelter for families, particularly during slow periods or when raw materials were scarce or expensive. Many blacksmith wives were forced to take on additional work such as spinning, weaving, or food preparation to supplement the family income, adding to the overall stress and workload of the household. Children in blacksmith families often began working at very young ages to help with basic tasks around the forge, exposing them to the same hazards that plagued their fathers. The social stigma associated with blacksmithing also affected family members, who might find themselves excluded from certain social activities or viewed with suspicion by their neighbors. The association of blacksmiths with supernatural or demonic forces extended to their families, creating barriers to marriage prospects for daughters and limiting opportunities for sons who might wish to pursue other occupations. The educational opportunities available to blacksmith children were typically limited, as the demands of the trade left little time or resources for formal schooling. Most blacksmith families could not afford to send their children to schools or to hire private tutors, meaning that literacy and numeracy remained uncommon among craftsman families. This lack of education perpetuated the cycle of limited opportunities and social mobility that trapped many blacksmith families in their circumstances for generations. The diet and nutrition of medieval blacksmiths were poor by modern standards and inadequate to meet the enormous physical demands of their profession. The high caloric requirements created by working in extreme heat while performing heavy physical labor were difficult to meet with the limited food options available to most craftsmen. Meat was expensive and often reserved for special occasions, while the staple foods of bread, porridge, and ale provided carbohydrates for energy, but lacked the protein and vitamins necessary for optimal health and recovery from the daily stresses of blacksmithing. The constant dehydration caused by working near the forge was compounded by the poor quality of available drinking water, which was often contaminated with bacteria and other pathogens that could cause serious illness. Many blacksmiths relied on ale or beer as their primary source of hydration, not because of any preference for alcohol, but because fermented beverages were generally safer than untreated water. This constant low-level alcohol consumption, while necessary for survival, added to the overall stress on their bodies and contributed to various health problems over time. Malnutrition was common among blacksmiths and their families, as the irregular income and high cost of quality food made it difficult to maintain a consistent, healthy diet. Vitamin deficiencies were widespread and contributed to a host of health problems including scurvy, night blindness, and various skin conditions that made the already harsh working conditions even more unbearable. The lack of fresh fruits and vegetables during winter months was particularly problematic, as blacksmiths needed to maintain their strength and health year-round to continue working at their demanding trade. Food preservation was another challenge that affected blacksmith families, as the heat and humidity generated by the forge created conditions that encouraged spoilage and pest infestation. Storing adequate supplies of food for the winter months was difficult without proper preservation techniques, and many families faced periods of genuine hunger during the coldest months, when work was scarce and stored food supplies ran low. The medical care available to medieval blacksmiths was primitive and often dangerous, providing little relief for the numerous occupational injuries and illnesses that plagued these craftsmen throughout their careers. The medical knowledge of the time was based largely on superstition and folk remedies that were often ineffective and sometimes harmful, meaning that even minor injuries could develop into serious complications that might permanently disable or kill a blacksmith. Burns, which were an inevitable part of blacksmithing, were typically treated with various animal fats, oils, or herbal preparations that provided little actual healing benefit and often led to serious infections. The concept of sterile wound care was unknown, and many blacksmiths died from infections that developed from what would now be considered minor injuries. The lack of effective pain relief meant that blacksmiths had to continue working despite serious injuries, often making their conditions worse and preventing proper healing. Respiratory problems caused by inhaling forge fumes were poorly understood and had no effective treatment, meaning that blacksmiths simply had to accept the gradual deterioration of their lung function as an unavoidable consequence of their trade. The chronic coughing, shortness of breath, and chest pain that affected most experienced blacksmiths were considered normal occupational hazards rather than treatable medical conditions, leaving these craftsmen to suffer without hope of relief or recovery. Musculoskeletal injuries from the repetitive motions and heavy lifting required in blacksmithing were similarly untreatable, as the medical understanding of anatomy and physiology was insufficient to provide effective interventions for joint pain, muscle strains, or spinal injuries. Many blacksmiths worked through severe pain for years or decades, using alcohol or crude herbal preparations to dull their discomfort while their conditions gradually worsened to the point of complete disability. The mental health challenges faced by medieval blacksmiths were perhaps the most overlooked aspect of their suffering, as the concept of psychological well-being was not well understood or valued in medieval society. The combination of chronic physical pain, social isolation, financial stress, and the constant pressure to maintain productivity in dangerous working conditions created levels of psychological stress that would be considered severe by modern standards. The monotonous, repetitive nature of much blacksmith work, combined with the social isolation imposed by the location and nature of their workshops, created conditions that we would now recognize as contributing to depression and other mental health problems. Many blacksmiths spent their entire working lives performing the same basic tasks over and over again, with little variation or opportunity for creative expression, leading to a sense of meaninglessness and despair that affected their overall quality of life. The constant exposure to danger and the regular occurrence of injuries created a state of chronic anxiety and hypervigilance that took a toll on the mental health of blacksmiths and their families. Living with the knowledge that each day could bring serious injury or death, and seeing colleagues and friends suffer permanent disabilities or fatal accidents, created psychological stress that had no outlet or treatment in medieval society. Sleep disorders were common among blacksmiths, as the physical pain from occupational injuries and the mental stress of their situation made it difficult to achieve the rest necessary for recovery from the day's labors. The irregular work schedules required during busy periods, combined with the need to maintain forge temperatures that might require attention throughout the night, disrupted normal sleep patterns, and contributed to chronic fatigue that made all other aspects of their work more difficult and dangerous. The lack of recreational opportunities or time for leisure activities meant that blacksmiths had few ways to relieve stress or find enjoyment outside of their work. The physical exhaustion from their daily labors left little energy for social activities, hobbies, or other pursuits that might have provided psychological relief from the pressures of their profession. This absence of work-life balance, combined with the social isolation inherent in their trade, created conditions that would inevitably lead to psychological breakdown for many individuals. The religious and spiritual aspects of medieval life provided some comfort and meaning for blacksmiths, but they also created additional sources of stress and conflict. The association of metalworking with supernatural forces made some blacksmiths targets of religious suspicion, as clergy and community members might view their abilities as evidence. OF deals with demonic powers or other forms of spiritual corruption. The physical demands of blacksmithing made it difficult to observe religious obligations, such as attending regular church services or participating in religious festivals and ceremonies. The need to maintain forge temperatures and complete urgent work orders often conflicted with religious observances, creating guilt and anxiety for blacksmiths who wanted to fulfill their spiritual duties but found themselves unable to do so without risking their livelihoods. The moral teachings of medieval Christianity emphasized humility, poverty, and spiritual rather than material concerns, values that often conflicted with the practical realities of running a successful blacksmith operation. The need to charge fair prices for their work and to accumulate the resources necessary to purchase tools and materials could be seen as evidence of greed or worldliness, creating internal conflicts for blacksmiths who struggled to reconcile their spiritual beliefs with the economic necessities of their profession. The environmental conditions in which blacksmiths worked were harsh and unhealthy in ways that extended beyond the immediate hazards of heat, smoke, and flying sparks. Most medieval forges were poorly ventilated spaces that trapped toxic fumes and created oppressive working conditions that would be considered violations of occupational safety standards by any modern measure. The constant exposure to carbon monoxide and other poisonous gases created chronic health problems that affected not only the blacksmiths themselves, but also any family members or workers who spent time in the vicinity of the forge. The noise pollution generated by blacksmithing operations created additional stress for both the craftsmen and their neighbors, as the constant hammering could be heard for considerable distances and often continued from before dawn until well after dark. This noise not only contributed to hearing damage for the blacksmiths, but also created tension with community members who found the constant din disruptive to their own daily activities and sleep. The fire hazards associated with blacksmithing were enormous and constant, as the high temperatures and open flames required for metalworking posed serious risks to surrounding buildings and communities. Many medieval towns and cities experienced devastating fires that began in blacksmith workshops, leading to regulations that required forges to be located away from other structures, but also contributing to the social isolation of blacksmiths who found themselves literally pushed to the margins of their communities. The waste products generated by blacksmithing, including metal shavings, slag, and ash from burned fuel, created environmental pollution that affected local air and water quality. The disposal of these materials was poorly regulated, and many blacksmith operations contaminated nearby soil and water sources with heavy metals and other toxic substances that posed health risks to entire communities. The technological limitations of medieval blacksmithing meant that even the most skilled craftsmen were forced to work with primitive tools and methods that made their jobs far more difficult and dangerous than necessary. The lack of precision measuring instruments made it difficult to produce consistent, high-quality products, leading to frustration and wasted materials when pieces failed to meet specifications or perform as intended. The absence of mechanical assistance for heavy lifting, precise positioning, or repetitive tasks meant that all work had to be done through human muscle power alone, creating enormous physical strain that contributed to the high rates of injury and disability among blacksmiths. Simple tasks that could be completed quickly and safely with modern equipment required hours of dangerous, exhausting labor that took a cumulative toll on the health and well-being of these craftsmen. The metallurgical knowledge available to medieval blacksmiths was limited and often based on superstition rather than scientific understanding, making it difficult to work with different types of iron and steel, or to achieve consistent results in heat treatment and other critical processes. This lack of technical knowledge led to frequent failures, wasted materials, and inferior products that reflected poorly on the blacksmith's reputation and reduced his income. Quality control was another persistent challenge, as blacksmiths had limited ability to test the strength, durability, or other critical properties of their finished products. Tools, weapons, and other items might fail catastrophically during use, creating liability issues and damaging the blacksmith's reputation within the community. The lack of standardized specifications or testing methods made it difficult to ensure consistent quality, leading to customer dissatisfaction and disputes over payment. The seasonal variations in temperature and weather conditions created additional challenges for blacksmiths, as extreme cold made it more difficult to heat the forge to proper working temperatures while consuming larger quantities of expensive fuel. Hot summer weather made working conditions even more unbearable than usual, as the ambient temperature combined with the heat from the forge could create life-threatening conditions for the craftsmen. Humidity and moisture posed constant problems for both the equipment and materials used in blacksmithing, as iron and steel were highly susceptible to rust and corrosion that could ruin expensive raw materials or damage finished products. The need to protect materials from moisture required additional storage facilities and preservation techniques that added to the overall cost and complexity of blacksmith operations. Wind conditions affected the operation of the forge, as strong winds could blow sparks and embers onto combustible materials or make it difficult to control the temperature and airflow necessary for proper metalworking. Calm conditions could be equally problematic, as the lack of natural ventilation would cause toxic fumes to accumulate in the workshop, creating dangerous working conditions for everyone present. The supply chain challenges faced by medieval blacksmiths were enormous and often insurmountable, as the transportation systems of the time were primitive and unreliable. Iron ore, coal, and other essential materials might have to be transported over great distances by cart or pack animal, a process that was slow, expensive, and subject to delays from bad weather, bandits, or political conflicts. The quality and consistency of raw materials varied widely, as there were no standardized grading systems or quality control measures for iron, coal, or other supplies. Blacksmiths might receive shipments of materials that were inferior in quality, contaminated with impurities, or otherwise unsuitable for their intended purposes, but they had little recourse for returning defective supplies or obtaining refunds for unusable materials. The seasonal availability of certain materials created additional planning challenges, as blacksmiths needed to anticipate their needs months in advance and accumulate supplies during periods when materials were available and affordable. This requirement for advanced planning and capital investment was particularly difficult for small operations that lacked the scope for advanced plans, resources to purchase and store large quantities of materials. The political instability that characterized much of the medieval period created additional uncertainties for blacksmiths, as wars, rebellions, and other conflicts could disrupt trade routes, inflate prices, or even lead to the confiscation of materials and equipment by military forces. Many blacksmiths found their operations severely disrupted by political events beyond their control, leading to financial losses and periods of enforced idleness that could threaten their survival. Taxation and other governmental demands placed additional financial burdens on blacksmiths, who were often seen as relatively wealthy members of their communities and therefore attractive targets for various forms of official and unofficial taxation. The irregular nature of blacksmith income made it difficult to plan for tax obligations, and the penalties for non-payment could include confiscation of tools and equipment that would effectively end a blacksmith's ability to earn a living. Military conscription was another threat that hung over the heads of young blacksmiths, as their physical strength and familiarity with weapons and armor made them attractive candidates for military service. Being forced into military service could mean the abandonment of years of training and investment in tools and equipment, with no guarantee of being able to resume their trade after completing their military obligations. The legal obligations associated with guild membership or feudal relationships created additional constraints on the freedom and autonomy of blacksmiths, who might be required to perform certain types of work at below market rates or to provide their services to particular customers, regardless of their personal preferences or business priorities. These obligations could conflict with more lucrative opportunities and limit the ability of blacksmiths to maximize their income or build successful businesses. Contract disputes were common in blacksmith operations, as the lack of standardized specifications and quality measures made it difficult to determine whether finished products met the agreed-upon requirements. Customers might refuse payment for work they considered unsatisfactory, while blacksmiths argued that they had fulfilled their obligations according to the original agreement. The primitive legal system provided little effective mechanism for resolving such disputes, often leaving blacksmiths with no recourse for collecting payment for completed work. The apprenticeship obligations that most blacksmiths had undertaken during their training created ongoing financial and social commitments that could persist for many years after achieving master status. Former apprentices might be required to provide financial support or other assistance to their former masters, while master blacksmiths had legal and moral obligations to their current apprentices that could be expensive and time-consuming to fulfill properly. Insurance and risk management were virtually unknown concepts in medieval times, meaning that blacksmiths had no protection against the financial losses that could result from fire, theft, injury, or other disasters. A single catastrophic event could wipe out years of accumulated wealth and equipment, leaving a blacksmith and his family destitute with no means of recovery or support. The competition between blacksmiths in the same area could be intense and sometimes destructive, as there was often insufficient demand to support multiple operations in smaller communities. This competition could lead to price wars that benefited customers, but left all the competing blacksmiths struggling to earn sustainable profits. Or it could escalate into more serious conflicts involving sabotage, theft, or violence. The lack of intellectual property protection meant that successful techniques, designs, or innovations could be copied freely by competitors, providing no incentive for blacksmiths to invest time and resources in developing better methods or products. This absence of protection for innovation contributed to the technological stagnation that characterized much of medieval blacksmithing and limited the potential for improvements in working conditions or productivity. Customer relations were often difficult and stressful, as blacksmiths had to deal with clients who had unrealistic expectations, inadequate budgets, or demanding deadlines that conflicted with the realities of metalworking processes. The seasonal nature of much agricultural work meant that farming customers often needed large quantities of tools and repairs completed in very short time frames, creating periods of intense pressure and stress for blacksmiths who had to work excessive hours to meet demand. Payment collection was a persistent problem, as many customers expected to receive goods and services on credit, but were slow to pay their debts or might default entirely on their obligations. Blacksmiths often had to continue working with customers who owed them money, as refusing service could mean losing important accounts and damaging their reputation within the community. The social expectations placed on blacksmiths as prominent members of their communities could be burdensome and expensive, as they might be expected to contribute to community projects, religious activities, or charitable causes, despite their often precarious financial situations. The visible nature of their work and the permanent location of their forges made it difficult for blacksmiths to avoid these social obligations or to conceal their financial circumstances from neighbors and community leaders. The legacy of injuries accumulated over years of blacksmithing created a cascading effect of disability that made each subsequent day of work more difficult and painful than the last. Yet the economic reality was that most blacksmiths could not afford to stop working even when their bodies were failing them. A blacksmith in his 40s might wake each morning with hands so arthritic that gripping a hammer caused excruciating pain. Yet he would still need to spend the next 12 hours swinging that same hammer hundreds of times to earn enough money to feed his family and maintain his workshop. The progressive nature of occupational injuries meant that blacksmiths faced a cruel irony, where their expertise and skill reached their peak just as their physical capacity to perform the work began to decline dramatically. A master blacksmith with 20 years of experience possessed knowledge and techniques that made him far more efficient and capable than a younger competitor. But his scarred hands, damaged hearing, compromised lungs, and aching joints made it increasingly difficult to translate that knowledge into productive work. The absence of any form of disability support or retirement system meant that blacksmiths who could no longer perform their trade faced destitution and starvation, creating a powerful incentive to continue working despite serious injuries or illnesses that should have forced them to rest and recover. Many blacksmiths worked literally until the day they died, collapsing at their anvils from heart attacks brought on by the combination of extreme physical exertion, chronic pain, and the stress of trying to maintain productivity despite failing health. The primitive understanding of workplace ergonomics meant that even minor adjustments that could have reduced strain and prevented injuries were unknown to medieval blacksmiths, who accepted pain and disability as inevitable consequences of their trade, rather than problems that might be solved through better equipment design or working methods. The height of anvils, the design of hammer handles, the positioning of forges, and countless other factors that modern occupational health experts recognize as critical to worker safety were left to chance or tradition rather than scientific analysis. The social isolation experienced by many blacksmiths was exacerbated by the physical disabilities that accumulated over their careers, as hearing loss made conversation difficult while chronic pain and fatigue reduced their energy for social activities. A blacksmith who had spent decades as a respected member of his community might find himself increasingly cut off from normal social interaction as his disabilities made it difficult to participate in the conversations, celebrations, and other activities that bound the community together. The lack of effective pain management created a constant background of suffering that affected every aspect of a blacksmith's life, from his ability to sleep and rest to his capacity for patience with family members and customers. The chronic pain that resulted from years of repetitive stress injuries, burns, and other occupational hazards was treated, if at all, with alcohol or crude herbal remedies that provided minimal relief while often creating additional health problems through dependency or toxic side effects. The mental toll of living with constant physical pain while maintaining the demanding schedule required by blacksmithing created psychological problems that were poorly understood and completely untreated in medieval society. The combination of sleep deprivation from pain-induced insomnia, chronic fatigue from working despite injuries, and the stress of financial insecurity created conditions that would inevitably lead to depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems for many blacksmiths. The family dynamics in blacksmith households were often strained by the physical and emotional demands of the trade, as wives and children had to cope with husbands and fathers who were frequently exhausted, in pain, and preoccupied with the constant pressures of maintaining their business. The irregular income and seasonal fluctuations in demand created additional stress for families who never knew whether they would have adequate resources to meet their basic needs from one month to the next. Children in blacksmith families often began working at very young ages out of economic necessity, exposing them to the same hazardous conditions that had damaged their fathers while depriving them of the education and childhood experiences that might have allowed them to pursue other careers. This perpetuation of the cycle of occupational hazard and limited opportunity meant that blacksmith families often remained trapped in the same pattern of hardship for generation after generation. The workshop environment itself was a constant source of stress and danger that extended beyond the immediate risks of fire and injury to include more subtle threats such as poor air quality, extreme temperature variations, and the psychological pressure of working in a space where a moment's inattention could result in serious injury or death. The forge area was typically cramped, poorly lit, and filled with obstacles and hazards that made every movement potentially dangerous. The tools and equipment used by medieval blacksmiths were not only primitive, but also dangerous in ways that modern safety standards would never tolerate, as sharp edges, heavy weights, and hot surfaces were typically unguarded and unmarked, requiring constant vigilance to avoid accidents. The tongs used to manipulate hot iron were often poorly designed and difficult to control, leading to frequent burns and dropped pieces that could cause serious injuries to the blacksmith or anyone else in the vicinity. The bellows systems used to maintain forge temperatures were physically demanding to operate and prone to mechanical failures that could interrupt work at critical moments, forcing blacksmiths to choose between abandoning partially completed work or attempting dangerous repairs on equipment that was still hot and under pressure. The leather components of bellows systems were particularly vulnerable to heat damage and required frequent replacement that was expensive and time-consuming. The storage and handling of raw materials created additional hazards, as heavy bars of iron had to be moved and positioned manually without the aid of mechanical lifting devices, leading to back injuries, crushing injuries, and other accidents that could permanently disable a blacksmith. The irregular shapes and sharp edges of much iron stock made it difficult to handle safely, while the weight of these materials made even simple tasks like organizing inventory physically demanding and dangerous. The coal and charcoal used to fuel forges created their own set of hazards beyond the obvious fire risk, as these materials generated toxic gases when burned and produced large quantities of ash and clinker that had to be removed from the forge regularly. The process of cleaning out a forge was hot, dirty, and dangerous work that exposed blacksmiths to burns, toxic dust, and sharp fragments of partially burned fuel. The water used for quenching hot iron created sudden clouds of steam that could cause severe burns while also creating visibility problems. That made it difficult to work safely around the forge. The rapid temperature changes involved in quenching also created stresses in the metal that could cause pieces to crack or shatter without warning, sending sharp fragments flying at high speed toward anyone in the vicinity. The finishing processes required to complete most blacksmith products involved grinding, filing, and polishing operations that generated metal dust and filings that were hazardous to breathe and could cause serious eye injuries. The tools used for these finishing operations were typically crude and difficult to control precisely, making it easy to ruin hours of work with a single careless movement, while also creating additional opportunities for cuts and other injuries. The customer interaction aspects of blacksmithing added another layer of stress to an already demanding profession, as blacksmiths had to manage the expectations and demands of clients who often had little understanding of the time, skill, and materials required to complete their requests. Customers might demand unrealistic deadlines, request modifications to completed work, or refuse payment for products they considered unsatisfactory, creating conflicts that could escalate into legal disputes or violence. The seasonal nature of much blacksmith work meant that during busy periods, craftsmen might be required to work 18 or 20 hours per day to meet demand, creating levels of fatigue and sleep deprivation that significantly increased the risk of accidents and injuries. The pressure to maximize income during peak seasons often led blacksmiths to accept more work than they could safely complete, resulting in compromised quality, missed deadlines, and dangerous working conditions. The competition with other blacksmiths could create additional pressure to work faster, charge less, or accept dangerous or unprofitable jobs that more established craftsmen might refuse. New blacksmiths trying to build their reputation and client base often found themselves taking on work that was beyond their skill level or accepting payment, terms that barely covered their costs, creating financial stress that compounded the physical and mental demands of the profession. The guild system that governed many blacksmithing operations created additional bureaucratic burdens and restrictions that interfered with the efficient operation of workshops while providing little actual benefit to working craftsmen. Guild meetings, ceremonial obligations, and regulatory compliance took time and energy away from productive work, while often imposing additional costs through fees, fines, and mandatory contributions to guild activities. The religious and moral expectations of medieval society created internal conflicts for blacksmiths who struggled to reconcile their need to earn a living with teachings that emphasized poverty, humility, and spiritual rather than material concerns. The association of metalworking with supernatural forces also created anxiety for some blacksmiths who worried that their profession might be incompatible with their spiritual beliefs or might expose them to accusations of heresy or witchcraft. The limited medical knowledge available to treat occupational injuries meant that even relatively minor problems could develop into serious disabilities that would affect a blacksmith for the rest of his life. A simple cut that became infected could lead to blood poisoning and death, while burns that were not properly treated could result in permanent scarring and loss of function that would severely limit a craftsman's ability to work effectively. The lack of understanding about occupational diseases meant that the gradual deterioration in health experienced by most blacksmiths was accepted as normal aging rather than preventable illness, leading to the development of chronic conditions that could have been avoided or mitigated with proper knowledge and precautions. The respiratory problems, hearing loss, and joint damage that affected most experienced blacksmiths were seen as unavoidable consequences of the trade rather than as symptoms of preventable occupational disease. The primitive state of metallurgical knowledge meant that blacksmiths often worked with materials and processes that they did not fully understand, leading to unpredictable results, wasted materials, and products that might fail catastrophically during use. The lack of scientific understanding about heat treatment, alloy composition, and other critical factors made blacksmithing as much art as science, requiring years of experience to develop the intuitive understanding necessary for consistent success. The absence of standardized measurements and specifications made it difficult for blacksmiths to produce consistent, interchangeable products, leading to custom work that was time-consuming and expensive, while providing little opportunity for efficiency improvements through standardization and specialization. Each product had to be individually crafted to meet specific customer requirements, preventing the development of production techniques that might have reduced both cost and physical demands on the craftsmen. The transportation challenges of medieval times meant that blacksmiths were often dependent on local sources of raw materials that might be of inferior quality or inconsistent availability, forcing them to work with whatever materials they could obtain, regardless of their suitability for specific applications. The high cost and unreliability of long-distance transportation made it impractical to seek out better materials from distant sources, limiting the quality and variety of products that could be produced. The primitive banking and credit systems available to medieval craftsmen made it difficult to finance major equipment purchases or to smooth out the seasonal fluctuations in income that characterized blacksmithing operations. Most blacksmiths operated on a cash basis with minimal reserves, making them vulnerable to any interruption in income or unexpected expense that might arise from equipment failure, injury, or other unforeseen circumstances. The legal system provided little protection for blacksmiths against customers who refused to pay for completed work or who made unreasonable demands for modifications or refunds, forcing craftsmen to choose between writing off losses or engaging in expensive and uncertain legal proceedings that might take months or years to resolve. The weak enforcement of contracts and the limited remedies available through the courts made it difficult for blacksmiths to protect their interests in disputes with customers or suppliers. The political instability that characterized much of the medieval period created additional uncertainties for blacksmiths, whose operations could be disrupted by wars, rebellions, or changes in local government that might affect their access to materials, their customer base, or their legal status within the community. The threat of military conscription was particularly serious for young blacksmiths, who might be forced to abandon their training and equipment to serve in armies that offered little prospect of survival or eventual return to civilian life. The environmental pollution generated by blacksmithing operations created health hazards that extended beyond the immediate workplace to affect entire communities, as the smoke, noise, and toxic waste products from forges could contaminate air and water sources while creating nuisance conditions that strained relationships with neighbors and local authorities. The lack of environmental regulations meant that these problems were typically ignored until they became severe enough to threaten public health or safety. The fire hazards associated with blacksmithing were enormous and constant, as the combination of high temperatures, open flames, and combustible materials created conditions where a moment's carelessness could result in devastating blazes that might destroy not only the blacksmith's workshop but entire neighborhoods. Many medieval towns experienced catastrophic fires that began in blacksmith shops, leading to regulations that required forges to be located away from other buildings, but also contributing to the social and economic isolation of blacksmiths. The waste disposal problems created by blacksmithing operations were significant and poorly managed, as the slag, ash metal filings, and other byproducts of metalworking had to be disposed of somehow, but often ended up contaminating local soil and water sources with heavy metals and other toxic substances. The lack of understanding about environmental contamination meant that these problems were typically ignored until they became so severe that they could no longer be overlooked. The occupational hazards faced by blacksmith families extended beyond the primary craftsmen to include wives, children, and other household members who lived and worked in proximity to the forge and were therefore exposed to many of the same toxic substances, physical dangers, and health risks that affected the blacksmiths themselves. The integration of living and working spaces that was common in medieval times meant that there was often no safe refuge from the hazards of blacksmithing within the family home. The social stigma associated with blacksmithing affected not only the craftsmen themselves, but also their families, who might find themselves excluded from certain social activities or viewed with suspicion by their neighbors due to the association of metalworking with supernatural or demonic forces. This social isolation could limit marriage prospects for daughters and educational or career opportunities for sons, perpetuating the cycle of limited social mobility that trapped many blacksmith families in their circumstances. The economic vulnerability of blacksmith operations made them attractive targets for various forms of extortion and exploitation by corrupt officials, criminal organizations, or unscrupulous competitors who recognized that these craftsmen had valuable equipment and materials but limited ability to protect themselves through legal or political channels. The isolated location of many forges and the valuable nature of their contents made them particularly vulnerable to theft and vandalism. The technological stagnation that characterized much of medieval blacksmithing meant that craftsmen were trapped using primitive tools and methods that made their work far more difficult and dangerous than necessary, with little prospect for improvement or innovation that might have reduced the physical demands or health hazards associated with their trade. The lack of scientific understanding and the absence of systematic research into better working methods meant that each generation of blacksmiths faced essentially the same challenges and hazards as their predecessors. The apprenticeship system that governed entry into blacksmithing created its own set of hardships and injustices, as young people were bound to masters for extended periods during which they received minimal compensation while being exposed to all the hazards and difficulties of the trade. The legal and economic power that masters held over their apprentices created opportunities for abuse and exploitation that were difficult for the young people to escape or report to authorities. The guild regulations that controlled many aspects of blacksmithing created additional burdens and restrictions that limited the freedom and economic opportunities available to working craftsmen, while often providing little actual benefit in terms of protection, training, or market stability. The fees, obligations, and bureaucratic requirements associated with guild membership consumed time and resources that might otherwise have been devoted to productive work or business development. The seasonal fluctuations in demand for blacksmith services created periods of intense activity, alternating with months of minimal income, making it difficult to maintain a stable household budget or to plan for major expenses such as equipment replacement or family emergencies. The feast or famine nature of blacksmith income created constant financial stress that affected every aspect of family life and made it difficult to accumulate the resources necessary for economic security or social advancement. The lack of effective quality control systems meant that blacksmiths had little ability to ensure the consistency and reliability of their products, leading to customer complaints, returned merchandise, and damage to their professional reputation when tools, weapons, or other items failed during use. The primitive testing methods available to medieval craftsmen provided little information about the strength, durability, or other critical properties of finished products. The supply chain vulnerabilities that affected blacksmith operations created constant uncertainty about the availability and cost of essential materials, forcing craftsmen to maintain expensive inventories of raw materials while still facing the risk of shortages that could shut down production for extended periods. The unreliability of medieval transportation and the political instability of the time made it difficult to establish dependable relationships with suppliers or to predict future material costs and availability. The primitive state of workplace safety knowledge meant that blacksmiths accepted levels of risk and exposure to hazardous conditions that would be considered completely unacceptable by modern standards, while having little understanding of the long-term health consequences of their working environment or the possibility of implementing protective measures that might have reduced their exposure to dangerous substances and conditions. The limited educational opportunities available to blacksmiths and their families meant that most were trapped in cycles of limited knowledge and narrow perspective that prevented them from recognizing opportunities for improvement or advancement that might have been available to more educated individuals. The focus on practical skills rather than theoretical knowledge meant that most blacksmiths had little understanding of the scientific principles underlying their craft or the possibility of applying systematic analysis to improve their methods and results. The social and economic constraints of medieval society meant that blacksmiths had little opportunity for geographic or occupational mobility, trapping them and their families in circumstances that might be unsuitable or undesirable, but difficult to escape through conventional means. The guild system, feudal obligations, and other institutional barriers made it difficult for skilled craftsmen to relocate to areas with better opportunities, or to transition into other occupations that might offer better working conditions or economic prospects. The primitive state of financial instruments and business practices meant that blacksmiths had few options for managing risk, smoothing income fluctuations, or financing business expansion, forcing them to operate with minimal reserves and constant vulnerability to any disruption in their operations or market conditions. The absence of insurance, banking services, or investment opportunities meant that blacksmiths had little protection against the various financial risks inherent in their profession. The legacy of occupational exposure to toxic substances meant that many blacksmiths suffered from chronic health problems that grew progressively worse with age, creating a downward spiral of declining physical capacity, reduced earning ability, and increasing medical expenses that often led to poverty and destitution in their later years. The lack of understanding about occupational disease meant that these health problems were typically attributed to natural aging, rather than preventable workplace exposure. Thus, the life of a medieval blacksmith represented a kind of slow-motion tragedy, where essential skills and vital social contributions were extracted through a system that systematically destroyed the health, happiness, and economic security of the craftsmen who provided them, creating a legacy of suffering that affected not only the blacksmiths themselves, but also their families and communities for generations. The romantic image of the noble craftsman working at his forge bears little resemblance to the harsh reality of medieval blacksmithing, which was characterized by constant physical danger, chronic health problems, economic insecurity, and social isolation that made it one of the most challenging and unrewarding occupations of its time. The blacksmiths who labored in these conditions deserved recognition not only for their technical skills and essential contributions to medieval society, but also for their remarkable endurance in the face of hardships that would challenge even the strongest and most determined individuals, creating through their sacrifice and suffering the foundation upon which medieval civilization was built and sustained through centuries of technological and social development that eventually led to the safer, more humane working conditions that modern craftsmen enjoy today. The psychological warfare that blacksmithing waged upon the human spirit was perhaps more insidious than the physical torments, as it slowly eroded hope, ambition, and the capacity for joy through the relentless repetition of painful, dangerous work that offered little prospect for meaningful improvement or escape. Each morning brought the same grim routine of lighting the forge, heating the iron, and beginning the endless cycle of hammer blows that would continue for 12 to 16 hours, punctuated only by the brief moments required to reheat metal or adjust the fire, creating a monotonous existence that ground away at the soul as surely as the work destroyed the body. The noise of blacksmithing was not merely loud, but possessed a particular quality of harshness that seemed designed to torment the human nervous system, as the sharp metallic ringing of hammer against anvil created sound waves that penetrated to the very core of consciousness and made sustained concentration or peaceful thought nearly impossible. After years of exposure to this acoustic assault, many blacksmiths developed a kind of mental numbness that protected them from the immediate discomfort, but also dulled their capacity for intellectual and emotional engagement with the world around them. The heat radiating from the forge created not only physical discomfort, but also a peculiar form of mental oppression, as the constant exposure to temperatures that pushed the limits of human endurance gradually wore down psychological resistance and created a state of chronic stress that affected every aspect of cognitive and emotional functioning. The brain's constant struggle to maintain normal function while coping with extreme environmental conditions left little mental energy available for creative thinking, problem solving, or the kind of reflective contemplation that might have provided some relief from the grinding routine of daily labor. The visual environment of the medieval forge was equally oppressive, as the combination of bright flames, flying sparks, and clouds of smoke created a chaotic, disorienting atmosphere that strained the eyes and made it difficult to maintain the visual focus necessary for precise work. The constant exposure to bright light from the forge, alternating with the deep shadows of the workshop, created vision problems that went beyond simple eye strain to include permanent damage to the retina and other structures of the eye, gradually reducing the blacksmith's ability to see clearly and work accurately. The social dynamics within blacksmith workshops were often characterized by hierarchy, competition, and exploitation that created additional psychological stress for craftsmen who were already struggling with the physical demands of their work. Master blacksmiths frequently treated their journeymen and apprentices harshly, viewing them as potential competitors rather than colleagues and using their superior position to extract maximum labor while providing minimal compensation or support. This atmosphere of mutual distrust and exploitation made the workplace a source of interpersonal conflict rather than the camaraderie that might have provided some relief from the other hardships of the trade. The economic pressures that constantly threatened blacksmith operations created a state of chronic anxiety that pervaded every aspect of life, as craftsmen never knew whether their next customer would pay promptly, whether their suppliers would deliver materials on schedule, or whether economic or political changes might suddenly destroy the market for their products. This uncertainty made it impossible to plan for the future or to develop the kind of financial security that might have provided some peace of mind and stability for blacksmith families. The seasonal nature of blacksmith work created psychological as well as economic challenges, as the intense pressure during busy periods alternated with long stretches of relative inactivity that could be equally stressful in different ways. During peak seasons, blacksmiths might work 20 hours per day for weeks at a time, creating levels of mental and physical exhaustion that bordered on delirium. While the slow periods brought anxiety about unpaid bills, concerns about maintaining skills during extended periods of inactivity, and the psychological challenge of finding meaning and purpose when work was scarce. The lack of intellectual stimulation in most blacksmith work created a form of mental atrophy that affected the cognitive development and emotional growth of craftsmen who spent their entire adult lives performing essentially the same basic tasks with little variation or opportunity for creative expression. The repetitive nature of most metalworking operations required physical skill and endurance, but provided little challenge for the mind, leading to a kind of intellectual stagnation that made it difficult for blacksmiths to adapt to changing circumstances or to develop new approaches to persistent problems. The isolation imposed by the location and nature of blacksmith workshops deprived these craftsmen of the social interaction that is essential for psychological health and emotional well-being, creating conditions that would inevitably lead to depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems for individuals who were already struggling with chronic physical pain and economic insecurity. The noise, smoke, and fire hazards associated with forges made them unwelcome neighbors in residential areas, forcing blacksmiths to work in isolation from the communities they served and limiting their opportunities for the kind of casual social contact that helps maintain mental health. The constant exposure to danger created a state of hypervigilance that was mentally exhausting and emotionally draining, as blacksmiths had to maintain constant awareness of the numerous hazards in their working environment while simultaneously concentrating on the precise techniques required for effective metalworking. This dual demand for both vigilance and focus created cognitive strain that contributed to mental fatigue and made it difficult to maintain peak performance throughout the long working days that were necessary for economic survival. The lack of effective medical treatment for the injuries and illnesses that inevitably resulted from blacksmithing created additional psychological stress, as craftsmen had to live with the knowledge that any accident or occupational disease might lead to permanent disability or death with little hope of effective intervention. The primitive state of medieval medicine meant that even relatively minor injuries could develop into life-threatening complications, creating a constant background of anxiety about health and mortality that affected every aspect of daily life. The family responsibilities that most blacksmiths carried added another layer of psychological pressure to an already overwhelming situation, as the need to provide for wives and children created additional motivation to continue working despite injuries, illness, or other circumstances that should have forced them to rest and recover. The knowledge that family members depended entirely on their ability to continue working made it psychologically impossible for many blacksmiths to acknowledge the severity of their health problems or to seek appropriate treatment that might require time away from the forge. The religious conflicts created by the association of blacksmithing with supernatural forces added spiritual anxiety to the many other forms of stress that these craftsmen faced, as some worried that their profession might be incompatible with their spiritual beliefs or might expose them to accusations of heresy or witchcraft. The dramatic visual spectacle of the forge, with its roaring flames and apparent transformation of base metal into useful tools, made it easy for superstitious observers to attribute supernatural powers to blacksmiths, creating social tensions that could escalate into serious persecution during periods of religious fervor or social unrest. The guild regulations and other bureaucratic requirements that governed blacksmithing operations created additional sources of psychological stress, as craftsmen had to navigate complex systems of rules, fees, and obligations that seemed designed more to extract money and assert control than to provide any meaningful benefit to working blacksmiths. The time and mental energy required to comply with these regulations detracted from the focus that should have been devoted to productive work while creating additional opportunities for conflict with authorities and competitors. The technological limitations of medieval metalworking created constant frustration for blacksmiths who recognized better ways to accomplish their tasks but lacked the tools, materials, or knowledge necessary to implement improvements. The gap between what could be imagined and what could actually be accomplished with available resources created a sense of intellectual imprisonment that was particularly frustrating for craftsmen with creative minds and innovative instincts who found themselves trapped in inefficient, dangerous working methods by circumstances beyond their control. The customer relationships that were essential for blacksmith success were often sources of additional stress rather than satisfaction, as clients frequently had unrealistic expectations about what could be accomplished within their budgets and deadlines, while showing little appreciation for the skill and effort required to meet their demands. The need to maintain good relationships with customers who might be demanding, unreasonable, or slow to pay created diplomatic challenges that required emotional labor in addition to the physical demands of the actual metalworking. The competitive pressures within the blacksmithing trade created additional psychological stress, as craftsmen had to balance the need to maintain good relationships with their colleagues against the economic necessity of competing for customers and market share. This tension between cooperation and competition made it difficult to develop the kind of professional relationships that might have provided mutual support and assistance during difficult periods, instead creating an atmosphere of suspicion and rivalry that added to the isolation experienced by individual blacksmiths. The lack of opportunities for professional development or career advancement meant that blacksmiths faced the psychologically crushing realization that their current circumstances represented not just their present situation, but likely their entire future, with little prospect for improvement or escape through conventional means. The knowledge that they would probably spend the remainder of their lives performing the same difficult, dangerous work under the same harsh conditions created a sense of hopelessness that undermined motivation and made it difficult to maintain the energy and enthusiasm necessary for high-quality work. The absence of retirement or disability support systems meant that blacksmiths had to confront the terrifying possibility that injury or age-related decline would leave them destitute and dependent on charity or family support that might not be available or adequate to meet their needs. This anxiety about the future created additional psychological pressure to continue working despite health problems that should have forced them to stop, creating a vicious cycle where the fear of being unable to work drove them to continue. working under conditions that accelerated their physical decline. The primitive understanding of occupational health and safety meant that blacksmiths accepted levels of risk and exposure that would be considered criminally negligent by modern standards, while having little understanding of the long-term consequences of their working conditions or the possibility of implementing protective measures that might have reduced their exposure to harmful substances in dangerous situations. This acceptance of unnecessary risk was not based on informed choice, but on ignorance and lack of alternatives that left blacksmiths vulnerable to preventable injuries and diseases. The social stigma associated with manual labor in general, and blacksmithing in particular, created additional psychological burdens for craftsmen who might have natural intelligence and creative abilities that would have been valued in other contexts but were dismissed or ignored because of their association with a trade that was considered crude and unsophisticated by the educated classes. This social devaluation of their work and abilities created feelings of frustration and resentment that added to the other psychological stresses of their profession. The limited educational opportunities available to blacksmiths and their families meant that most were trapped in cycles of ignorance that prevented them from understanding the broader social, economic, and technical forces that shaped their lives and limited their opportunities for improvement or advancement. The focus on practical skills rather than theoretical knowledge meant that blacksmiths often had little understanding of why their work was so difficult and dangerous, or whether better alternatives might exist in other times or places. The lack of effective communication systems meant that blacksmiths were often isolated from information about new techniques, market conditions, or other developments that might have helped them improve their operations or adapt to changing circumstances. The slow and unreliable communication methods of medieval times meant that important information might take months or years to reach isolated craftsmen, if it reached them at all, leaving them vulnerable to being blindsided by changes they could not anticipate or prepare for. The primitive state of record-keeping and business management meant that most blacksmiths had little systematic understanding of their own operations, making it difficult to identify problems, track performance, or plan improvements that might have enhanced their efficiency or profitability. The lack of standardized accounting methods or performance metrics meant that blacksmiths often worked by intuition and tradition rather than systematic analysis, missing opportunities for optimization that might have reduced their workload or increased their income. The legal vulnerabilities that affected blacksmith operations created additional psychological stress, as craftsmen had limited recourse against customers who refused to pay, suppliers who delivered inferior materials, or competitors who used unfair practices to gain market advantages. The weak enforcement mechanisms available through the medieval legal system meant that blacksmiths often had to accept losses and injustices that would have been preventable with more effective legal protections and enforcement mechanisms. The environmental hazards created by blacksmithing operations extended beyond the immediate workplace to affect entire communities, creating social tensions that could make blacksmiths unwelcome in their own neighborhoods and adding to the isolation and psychological stress that characterized their profession. The smoke, noise, and fire hazards associated with forges made them problematic neighbors, while the lack of effective pollution control meant that these negative impacts could not be easily mitigated through technological solutions. The generational nature of blacksmith families meant that children were often exposed to the hazards and limitations of the trade from birth, creating cycles of limited opportunity and occupational risk that trapped entire family lines in circumstances that might be unsuitable or dangerous but difficult to escape through conventional means. The lack of educational or economic alternatives meant that blacksmith children often had little choice but to follow in their father's footsteps, perpetuating patterns of hardship and risk that might have been preventable with better social and economic policies. The primitive state of financial instruments and business practices meant that blacksmiths had few options for managing the various risks inherent in their operations, forcing them to operate with minimal reserves and constant vulnerability to any disruption in their business or market conditions. The absence of insurance, credit systems, or investment opportunities meant that blacksmiths had little protection against the numerous threats to their economic survival and limited ability to take advantage of opportunities that might have improved their circumstances. The technological stagnation that characterized much of medieval blacksmithing meant that craftsmen were trapped using inefficient and dangerous methods that had been developed centuries earlier, with little prospect for innovation or improvement that might have reduced the physical demands or health hazards associated with their work. The lack of systematic research and development that each generation of blacksmiths faced, essentially the same challenges and limitations as their predecessors, with little cumulative progress towards safer or more efficient working methods. The occupational diseases that inevitably resulted from years of exposure to forged conditions created progressive disability that made each day of work more difficult and painful than the last, while the lack of effective medical treatment meant that these conditions could only be expected to worsen over time. The knowledge that their health was deteriorating irreversibly while their economic circumstances made it impossible to stop working created a sense of being trapped in a downward spiral with no possibility of escape or recovery. The social isolation that characterized the lives of many blacksmiths extended beyond their working hours to affect their entire existence, as the physical exhaustion from their daily labor left little energy for social activities while they're damaged. Hearing and chronic pain made normal conversation and interaction difficult or impossible. The combination of geographic isolation due to the location of their workshops and social isolation due to the stigma associated with their trade created conditions that were profoundly lonely and psychologically damaging. The lack of intellectual stimulation and creative expression in most blacksmith work created a form of spiritual poverty that was as damaging as the physical hardships of the profession, as craftsmen spent their entire adult lives performing repetitive tasks that provided little opportunity for growth, learning, or the kind of meaningful accomplishment that gives life purpose and value. The reduction of human potential to mere physical labor represented a tragic waste of intellectual and creative capacity that affected not only the blacksmiths themselves, but also the broader society that was deprived of their potential contributions in other fields. The primitive understanding of human psychology and emotional needs meant that the mental health problems that inevitably resulted from the harsh conditions of blacksmithing were neither recognized nor treated, leaving craftsmen to suffer in isolation with depression, anxiety, and other psychological disorders that compounded their physical problems and made their already difficult lives even more unbearable. The stigma associated with mental illness meant that blacksmiths who developed psychological problems had even fewer resources for help and support than those who suffered from physical injuries. The lack of hope for meaningful improvement in their circumstances created a kind of spiritual death that preceded physical demise, as blacksmiths gradually lost the capacity for joy, enthusiasm, and the other positive emotions that make life worth living, becoming increasingly mechanical and emotionally numb as a psychological defense against the constant stress and suffering of their existence. This emotional deadening was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their profession, as it robbed them not only of happiness, but also of the human connections and experiences that might have provided some compensation for their physical hardships. The legacy of medieval blacksmithing was thus not only one of essential technological contribution to human civilization, but also one of systematic human suffering that reflected the broader patterns of exploitation and neglect that characterized much of medieval society, where the essential work of maintaining and advancing human civilization was extracted through systems that showed little regard for the health, happiness, or dignity of the individuals who performed it. The blacksmiths who labored under these conditions represented both the best and worst aspects of human society. The ingenuity, skill, and dedication that drive technological progress, and the willingness to sacrifice individual well-being for collective advancement that has characterized much of human history and continues to shape the world today.